As most of you know, Senator Cotton is a Republican from Arkansas. He is a prominent conservative voice in our nation, and he is a leader on national security issues in the United States Senate. He is the only member of his party to serve on both the Senate Intelligence and the Senate Armed Services Committee. He is the youngest member of the U.S. Senate, and he is frequently mentioned as a future presidential candidate. He has a fascinating resume. He was born in rural Arkansas. He grew up on his family's cattle ranch. He attended both Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He clerked for a federal judge. He was in private practice, private legal practice for a period of time, and then he upended all of that by joining the United States Army. He turned down an appointment to serve in the JAG Corps and insisted in serving in the infantry. So with all that as background, Senator, let me kick this off with what I think is a key question. There are a lot of ordinary Americans across the country. I run into them every day. And there are members of Congress in both parties who question whether the U.S. should have a leadership role in the world or not. Some who question whether we should have it at all, and some who question whether it should be circumscribed in some significant way. And I know you don't believe that. I know you believe that the U.S. needs to play a leadership role in the world. So with that in mind, how do you make the case to both your constituents, to average Americans, and to your colleagues in the Congress on why this is so important?
Well, first off, thanks, Mike and Fred. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for having me here in these important conversations today. On that question, how you make the case to the American people, the source of all ultimate political power in our country, about the need for American leadership in the world. First, I don't think it's as dire as it's sometimes portrayed in the news. Most Arkansans whom I encounter are proud of our country. They're proud of what we've accomplished over 200 years in defending not only our freedom and democracy, but help spreading it around the world. That doesn't mean they buy into or accept every single project and venture initiative out in the world, but it does mean I think that there is a pretty sizable reservoir of goodwill, of pride, of understanding of the role that America needs to play. Foreign policy is very different, though, than domestic policy. When you're in my position, when you're an elected official who is at home with our voters. We all live domestic policy, and we experience it firsthand. Ronald Reagan had a joke in the 1980 presidential campaign that said, recession is when your brother-in-law loses his job, a depression is when you lose your job, and recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his job. But it's hard no matter how much spin the president or the party in power tries to put on the economy. If people are not feeling that, if their family, their community, their region is not feeling that prosperity, it's hard to try to explain them into it. Likewise, on some hot button issues, usually you're only going to operate very much around the margins on issues like, say, gun control or abortion. Because people have developed pretty firm opinions about that through their own lived experience in their communities. That's not the case in foreign policy. Most Americans are not routinely engaged with other nations and regions of the world. Even those who are, some of you, for instance, you may be deeply engaged in Europe or in East Asia or so forth. That doesn't mean that you know all that much about Brazil or the Middle East or vice versa. So the kinds of questions you receive, in my experience as an elected official, on domestic issues are, you might call them cross-examination questions, trying to confirm that you agree with them. You're not going to raise my taxes, are you? You're not going to vote to take away our guns, are you? Because they have pretty firm opinions. But in foreign policy, the questions tend to be much more open-ended and kind of inquisitive about ends and means, like, what should we do about Yemen? What should we do about Syria? What should we do about North Korea? So you have in foreign policy a greater opportunity to inform and persuade, in my experience, than you do in domestic policy. And that's one reason why I probably spend a little bit more time than some of my colleagues speaking out about it. Not only do I think it's the most fundamental obligation our government has, but it's also an area where public leadership can make the biggest difference.
So one of the questions I've heard, Senator, a number of times is, or as I go around the country, is why does it matter to me? This is the questioner. Why does it matter to me what the Russians are doing in Ukraine? Why does it matter to me what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea? How do you answer that kind of question?
So I always try to bring it back to our safety and our security. You know, the fundamental strategic goal of the United States since our founding has been to prevent attacks on our people and on our territory. That has happened on occasion. It happened on 9/11. It happened in the War of 1812. But by and large, we've been successful over 200 years in doing so. One way we do that is to defend forward. We don't want to play home games. That's one reason why we had the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century. I'd say we still have it today to a degree, but it's one reason why we made the decision after World War II that we could no longer count on two big oceans to protect us. They do a lot to protect us. A lot of nations would like to have those, but we couldn't count on it. And to defend forward, we needed allies, we needed bases forward, so we didn't have to fight our way forward. And we needed to contain our adversaries on the littoral of the old world. And those small incremental encroachments do make a difference. If China claims hegemony over the South China Sea, if Russia reduces Eastern Europe into essentially vassal states, they can make a difference. Maybe they won't make a difference now, but they can make a difference over time. And ultimately, too, again, this goes back, I think, to the reservoir of pride and goodwill that so many Americans have for America's global power, that it's an affront to America's honor whenever that happens to our allies. And that is not something that we can take lightly, because being dishonored or being seen as unreliable in small matters can very quickly lead to people thinking that will happen in large matters as well.
Great. Good transition to our adversaries. And what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is sort of run through a list of those and get your reaction to each in terms of what you see as the fundamental issue, the fundamental threat, the fundamental challenge, and then what you think the United States needs to do about it.
Are we going to rank order them?
I'm not. I'm going to actually do it in reverse order. So we're going to put the most important one last, okay? So we're going to start with Russia. Russian aggression, which has increased significantly, as you know, over the last several years.
It has. You might say that, in Vladimir Putin's mind, he doesn't think Russia lost the Cold War. They were just behind at halftime. So they've been catching up now for many years. I think we have to recognize that Russia remains the only country that can destroy our way of life because of its legacy nuclear arsenal and its crash nuclear modernization program. We have to take that seriously. We have to modernize our nuclear weapons. We need to be spending more on missile defense to make sure that they don't gain a strategic advantage on us. They have certain other legacy skills, or you might say, in the intelligence
world,
for instance.
Yeah.
But in many ways, Russia is a declining power that lashes out of insecurity or just seizes opportunities that it is presented on its periphery. Russia's economy is two-thirds the size of Italy, and Italy's economy is not exactly in the greatest shapes right now. And they've got real problems with their population as well. One thing I think is important to do, therefore, is to simply impose a new set of boundaries on Russia. Boundaries in Ukraine, boundaries in the Baltics, boundaries when it came to the kind of meddling we saw in our 2016 campaigns, being very precise and specific about things that we know they're doing and actions that we will take in response. So for instance, in early 2015, less than a year after the seizure of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine, most Senate Republicans and Democrats on the Armed Services Committee advocated for supplying lethal defensive weapons, things like Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. The Obama administration made a decision not to. The Trump administration finally, after a lot of internal debate, came around to that. That's the kind of thing, like specific actions are going to be met with specific reactions that you will not like. Violating the INF Treaty is going to be met with us withdrawing from the INF Treaty and building missiles that threaten you a lot more than your intermediate range missiles threaten us, unless you plan to base them in Mexico or Canada. Those kinds of actions that impose a clear set of boundaries on Vladimir Putin without making him out to be 10 feet tall or that he's some kind of master manipulator for the world, and keeping in perspective that they are in many ways a declining power relative to what I expect will be the last country on your list, China.
So Iran's desire for hegemony in the region, Iranian nuclear program, your sense of that issue and what we need to do.
I think the steps we've taken over the last year are largely the correct steps. As you know, I opposed the nuclear deal with Iran because I thought it didn't really do anything to stop Iran's nuclear program. It only delayed it, and the delay wasn't even that long in terms of the life and the thinking of a nation state. And it did nothing. In fact, it empowered Iran's malevolent activities throughout the region. Exiting that deal, imposing sanctions on Iran, taking actions with our allies in the regions to try to control or roll back some of Iran's advances in the region are the right way to go. I might have been a little more aggressive on oil sales with some of our allies. I'd certainly be pushing them behind the scenes to get down to zero as quickly as possible. And I think some of the other steps that Iran takes, Secretary Pompeo addressed in a speech a couple months ago. He laid out 12 points. These are not unreasonable things. We're not asking them to become, liberal democracy. We're not demanding they become Belgium or the Netherlands. We just want them to start acting like a normal nation state and not a revolutionary cause.
And then put Saudi Arabia and what just happened in Saudi Arabia in the context of Iran, and then how you think about the Saudi relationship as a result of that.
So the U.S.-Saudi relationship is very important, not just for the United States, not just for Saudi Arabia, but for the entire region and the entire world. There's a reason why every U.S. president, and we've had some very different kinds of presidents since the 1940s, have viewed that relationship as critical to our security and international security since FDR and Abdulaziz met on that destroyer in the Red Sea. Saudi Arabia is going through a lot of transition, though. After the founder died, being ruled by a succession of brothers who had their own kind of internal power-sharing structure throughout the various ministries, worked for a long time. Everybody knew you'd get to the point, though, when that system no longer works, when you had to transition from sons of the founder to grandsons. And when you're dealing with dozens, that system worked. When you're dealing with thousands, that system does not. That comes at a time when that kind of political instability in the Saudi model comes at a time when they're also facing a lot of insecurity because of Iran and the threats that they pose and their efforts to undermine Saudi stability and to push on the Saudi periphery in places like Yemen, as well as economic insecurity, as the United States surpasses Saudi Arabia and Russia as the world's largest producer of oil and gas, as more countries develop more sources of fuel that makes them less dependent on oil and gas. They've got to diversify their economy as well. So they have a lot of sources of insecurity or instability or pressure. Some of that is coming from Iran, and I think that's one reason why they've become a more aggressive or bolder foreign policy for Saudi Arabia than their traditional, very conservative foreign policy. And I mean that not in like the American conservative sense, but in the sense of being very reluctant to take risks or act, with kind of bold audacity you see in some places today.
Islamic extremism, and the reason I raise it is because since we've removed the caliphate largely, it's almost all gone, as you know, maybe a little piece of it left, the issue of terrorism has gone down in the minds of Americans. That worries me. As you know, there are extremists from West Africa all the way to East Asia. So how should we think about that issue? And we're engaged on it every day militarily and from an intelligence perspective, right? How should Americans think about that, and what should we be doing because at some point in time, another ISIS is going to pop up somewhere, and we're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah. So in a way, I think it's a good thing that it's not the dominant concern, the front mind of Americans, the way it was for so much of the last 2 decades, as long as that doesn't lead to a mindset change back to the conditions that led to 9/11. As long as we recognize that there are still Islamic extremists all around the world who commit atrocities in their own lands, many times against fellow Muslims, but who, more than anything, would like to take a shot at the title, which is an attack on U.S. interests and citizens, but especially an attack on the U.S. homeland. As long as we don't forget that, and as long as we maintain the financial, intelligence, and military pressure that we've put on those organizations like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, I think it's something that we can continue to try, that we'll continue to reduce the likelihood of those spectacular attacks. If we go back to a sense of where this is a law enforcement problem and the FBI, with all the other demands on the FBI's time, can resolve it, and we can issue indictments and in absentia and maybe get them extradited sometime, then we're more likely to face those kind of attacks in the future.
So within that context, how do you think about Afghanistan? We've been there for 17 years, right?
Yeah.
It looks like if we leave, we're creating huge risks. Staying is really hard to see how we win. So how do you think about that?
Well, the simplest case I make to Arkansans, because this is one issue where they do ask, like, gosh, why are we still there? We've been there for so long. We just lost a few more troopers a couple of weeks ago. Shouldn't we just leave? Like, well, we have been there for a long time, and we've spent a lot of money there, and we've lost a lot of lives there. But we've also been in South Korea for 65 years as well, and we have more than 2 times as many troops in South Korea today as we do in Afghanistan. They're not engaged in the same kind of frontline activity that they are in Afghanistan, but just to put that in perspective, we've been in Europe for the same amount of time, and we have about 15 to 20 times the troops we have there. Afghanistan's the one place from which an attack on our homeland was planned and launched, and it's the one place from which we decisively ejected Al-Qaeda. Now, they've reorganized and reconstituted or redesignated themselves in various ways, oftentimes across the border, but it's still it's one area where we decisively ejected them at the very beginning of this war. And there are indicators that if we were to simply withdraw our troops, that the Taliban and its associated terrorist forces would once again be flying the flag over Afghan cities. And as you know from your work, one thing that these terrorist organizations needs more than anything else is security and protection to be able to put together the kind of external operations that they conducted on 9/11. I've been on the opposite side of the field, and if you don't have a stable base where you got Joes out on the fence guarding it, and you can eat and you can sleep and you can sit down and plan and you can train, but rather you're always on the run because you never know when the next raid might come. You never know when you might be ambushed on the road. You never know when you might be struck by American air power. It's a lot easier if you have that kind of stable base from which to plan and project power in external operations. And I fear that's what we would be giving back to so many foreign terrorist organizations if we left Afghanistan hastily.
North Korea. Obviously, the issue is their strategic weapons program, right? How do you think about sort of where we are and where we need to go?
Yeah, North Korea is a hard problem, obviously. This is one reason why we don't want countries like Iran to get nuclear weapons. The president has taken some modest steps to try to get Kim Jong-un to denuclearize. I think Kim Jong-un and his regime is still trying to figure out exactly what that means to them and how little they can get away with and how much they can get in return. I don't think we should be giving them much, if at all, in return. I, for one, would have continued the brigade and higher level exercises that we need to conduct on the Korean Peninsula with the ROK forces to maintain our readiness. I would not at all back down from the sanctions. I'd probably try to be stricter in enforcing, in particular, sanctions on ship-to-ship transfer of oil off the Korean Peninsula. And I wouldn't let this drag on forever. I'd give them some reasonable amount of time. It's been now about 6 months since the summit in Singapore. I'm not saying that it has to end tomorrow or next month, but I'm not sure that it's a next decade kind of thing or even a next year kind of, well.
It's really important.
Next year after next year, since we're at the end of the year.
Really important to keep the sanctions as tight as we possibly
Absolutely.
can, right? And not let promises of denuclearization reduce those sanctions.
Yeah, there has to be concrete action, several concrete actions, given North Korea's history, in my opinion, in return for any concrete U.S. Or coalition action in return.
Okay, you guessed it. The last one.
I will say, in the meantime, we ought to use the time that this is buying to fortify our defenses, to deploy more Patriot systems and THAAD systems, and working on innovative kinds of missile defense systems. I know those can be controversial when they're discussed in the strategic context against Russia or China. I frankly don't understand why anybody would object to that kind of crash course of a regional missile defense to supplement our strategic defenses on the West Coast, whether it's airborne systems or shipborne systems that are designed to defeat North Korean missile launches.
Okay, China.
So China's in the category of Russia, not Iran and North Korea, because it's a near-peer competitor. It's very different, though, than Russia, since Russia, as I said, in many ways is a declining power, putting aside some of its Cold War legacy abilities. China is a rising power. It's the largest country in the world. It has an economy that's almost the size of ours. It has a leader who now has committed his country on the course to trying to establish not just China as a regional hegemon, but as a global one, and displace the United States over the course of the next century. We ought not allow those things. We have a lot of advantages. One of the biggest advantages we have is that we have a lot of allies and friends. I'm not really aware of any country on the Chinese periphery that wants to be a vassal state to China. China approaches those countries many ways on those terms. We're big, you're small. You have to do what we say. In other words, Vladimir Putin at least knows how to speak the language of the salons of Europe. That's not really the way China approaches our allies in that region. So we should be doing everything we can to keep those allies cemented, not just to us, but to each other. They obviously have a lot of historical tensions between themselves. That's one role that we've always played there. Modernizing our conventional forces and in a way that prepares them to deter against Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific is very important, especially for the Air Force and the Navy. Protecting our economy, which is the context in which most Americans have thought about China for a long time, the cost that China's market manipulations and state-run model of economic growth has hurt a lot of American communities. I think only in the last couple, 3 years, they've begun to be attuned to the security threats because there's been so much more discussion of them. Some of these are old-fashioned threats, you might say, missiles and ships and so forth. Some of them are familiar to us, but still somewhat cutting edge, like anti-satellite systems and information warfare in space. Some of them are very cutting edge, and it's still unclear what kind of model is going to emerge, whether it's quantum computing or artificial intelligence, those kinds of things. I just think that we need to recognize that China is a unique adversary in the world. I can report pretty happily that in Congress, that's the dominant view among both Democrats and Republicans, is that people recognize that China is a unique kind of adversary, not just in the military dimension, but political, financial, economic, and so forth.
Yeah. You talked about the importance of allies and partners in dealing with China, and historically it's absolutely true. When China gets faced by a large number of countries, they sometimes change their approach. And with that in mind, I'm just wondering where you were on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and whether you think some form of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, perhaps under a different name, would be a possibility going forward.
I think tighter economic relationships on fair and reciprocal terms with all those countries are in our mutual interest from an economic standpoint, but also in our security interest against China. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was doomed in 2016 when both parties, presidential candidates, opposed it. That doesn't happen if it has the kind of political support that a trade agreement needs. to be approved by the United States Congress. But we have a new agreement with Mexico and Canada, and we hopefully will get a better trading agreement with Japan. That alone starts to account for the dominant share of GDP that was within the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Not to say that the other 7 or 8 countries aren't important. We should pursue agreements with them as well. But I think that's the most likely path forward in trying to knit together even tighter the trading and security relationships we have with all those countries in the Western Pacific.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit here. So the first question was about the willingness of the United States to lead in the world, right? And the second part of the discussion was the threats and challenges we face. But I know you also think a lot about our capabilities, right, to lead in the world and to respond in the world. So defense modernization, enhancing intelligence, Budget Control Act, how we compete on the technological front. How do you think about all that, and what's most important to you as you do?
Well, Congress's most fundamental power is the spending power. And that's the simplest way that we can influence the direction of our government, especially our military. So it's a constant fight every year under the Budget Control Act of 2011 to make sure our military gets the money that it needs. Early this year, we passed a 2-year budget that had a substantial increase in our defense budget to just over $700 billion. There's still 2 years left of the Budget Control Act, though, in fiscal years 2020 and 2021. I believe, and I hope that most of my colleagues will agree, that we should eliminate those spending caps early next year. Now, I am concerned about the size of our deficit. I've just seen the pattern play out over my 6 years in the Congress. It's always the same. These caps are in place. Both parties, prefer to see money spent on their priorities and their voters' priorities. You get late into the fiscal year, you get a continuing resolution that doesn't allow the Department of Defense especially to plan for things like multi-year block buys of major weapon systems. You then end up getting a budget agreement that lifts those spending caps. So you don't have the spending discipline, but you also don't have the spending prudence of being able to plan in the long term. That's why that agreement earlier this year was for the best. Something like that to eliminate the fiscal year 2020 and 2021 caps early next year would be the same thing. I saw that, in recent days, reports that the president has said that he's going to exempt the Department of Defense from a 5% cut. In fact, they may submit a budget between 733 and maybe up to 750 billion. I think that's a responsible increase given the threats we face and given the big cuts that our military faced over the last 10 years. That's the most fundamental thing that we can do, is to make sure that our military has adequate but also stable and predictable funding. Then you get down into the details of it. I mean, the most important thing that our military does and the most important weapons we have are our nuclear weapons. Some people, whether they're just nervous about nuclear war or whether they believe in global zero, will say, we shouldn't spend so much money on weapons we never use. I would retort that we don't spend that much money on nuclear weapons. Depending on where we are in the modernization cycle, it's only 3 to 6% of our defense budget. And in fact, we use them every single day, and we have since 1945, which is one reason why there has not been great power general war since 1945. But we don't live, frozen in time. Yeah. Russia is rapidly modernizing its nuclear forces. China, we believe, is doing the same in different ways. They're certainly modernizing advanced conventional weapons like hypersonic glide vehicles that may require strategic responses. So over the next couple years, I want to make sure that we're spending the money necessary to continue the nuclear modernization that started under a Nuclear Posture Act from Bob Gates and would continue under the current one under Jim Mattis.
Yeah, I wrote an op-ed recently with Senator
Kyle. I liked it.
And I got blasted on Twitter. I mean, just absolutely blasted.
This is some of the, I was a young guy. I didn't live through it, but I've read some of the histories about the debates about arms control and strategic arms in the 70s and 80s. The kind of thinking, rigorous analytical thinking that went into those debates, though, is lost in a lot of quarters today because until just the last 5 years, really, there hasn't been a lot of thought given to our nuclear deterrent. We're now at a time where we have to give it. When Secretary Mattis's review poses things like a sea-launched cruise missile, a lot of folks in Congress, are appalled by it. They don't realize that we had those until just a few years ago, or what's sometimes called tactical or low yield or non-strategic nuclear weapons. They don't realize that we have had a huge arsenal of those in the past, or that Russia is building them right now. And the simplest case, you can go back and forth on it, the simplest case for it is Russia has them and we don't, which give Russia greater freedom of action and raises a real question. If they use a small artillery shell or short-range missile to detonate a nuclear warhead on a brigade troop assembly area or a part of disembarkation, are we really going to respond with a 100-kiloton or city-killing nuclear weapon?
Right, and the scary thing is they don't believe we will. Yeah.
Well, but if you have the weapons that they have, it doesn't make, in my opinion, it doesn't make those weapons more likely for both sides to use. It makes it less likely for Russia to use in the first place.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, we're going to open this to questions. I just want to ask the Senator one more question, which is, who in the history of American foreign policy, national security center, do you admire the most, who you think really has something to speak to us today about? And that's a tough question.
Present company excluded?
Yes.
Okay.
Steve Kappas is over.
We've had a lot of great statesmen throughout our time. Presidents, secretaries of state, generals. Hard to narrow it down to just one. I've been doing a lot of Civil War reading lately. The statesmanship of Lincoln, even though he struggled to find the right generals, and the generalship of U.S. Grant, pretty amazing given what they faced at the time. Pure foreign policy, though, at least someone who can probably speak to us today and is underappreciated, be John Quincy Adams, the author of the Monroe Doctrine when he was Secretary of State to James Monroe. I think the Monroe Doctrine, still, as I said earlier, it's still relevant to us today, but it's an example of strategic elegance to achieve strategic ends with the minimal commitment of resources and risk possible. We were worried about a young and somewhat fledgling nation, about European colonization of Latin America, British meddling in North America after the Congress of Vienna. We didn't have the Navy to try to stop that. Great Britain was one of our main adversaries. American foreign policy thinkers spent more time thinking about Great Britain for 150 years easily than anyone ever thought about the Soviet Union during the Cold War, to put it in scale. So John Quincy Adams, who had been ambassador to almost every major power in Europe, been senator, would become president, and then later member of Congress. And James Monroe, since he was the president, recognized that we could achieve our strategic goals of protecting our homeland from European colonization and potentially, in the long run, invasion on Britain's dime. That Britain shared that same interest at the Congress of Vienna in not allowing its continental adversaries to colonize parts of the New World, develop trade relationships, develop the natural resources that Britain benefited so much from. So we declared a policy that met our strategic ends that we really did not have to commit many resources to obtain. That kind of strategic elegance, I think, it should be the goal of foreign policy thinking.
Okay, questions from the audience? And I can't see very well, so I guess we have one right here in the middle.
Hi, I'm April Foley. I'm on the council, on the Ambassador's Advisory Council. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on the Russian seizure of Ukrainian vessels and their apparent or possible desire to get greater control of the Sea of Azov, and what you think the U.S. response might be to that.
Yeah, that's not a good development. To the extent we can head off things like that by doing what I said earlier, by stating clearly to Vladimir Putin or his main proxies, that we know what they're up to and that we will respond with appropriate measures that will be more painful to him than the benefit of his coming action is. Ought to have done that. But now that it's done, we ought to, one, take actions against those people that were involved. Maybe that can involve more sanctions or withholding of visas for them, their organizations, their families, what have you. But we also ought to support not just Ukraine, but the other nations that have trading relationships with Ukraine that use the Kerch Strait and the Sea of Azov to reach Mariupol, for instance, to ensure that that strait, like any waterway around the world, is free and open to commerce. But it's the kind of thing that, again, that we should, the small step that Vladimir Putin takes, seeing a target of opportunity, that we ought not turn a blind eye to, because it will encourage him to just take a more aggressive and a more destabilizing step in the future.
Over here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Insan Kang, and I'm with Chosun Daily News, that's South Korean newspaper. And I have a question about U.S. ROK joint military exercise. United States has suspended a few and considered to scale down next one. And how long do you think you can wait for North Korea to respond to any suggestion of United States without U.S. ROK joint military exercise? And do you think you can just wait indefinitely?
No, I wouldn't. As I said earlier, I would not have suspended them, and I would unsuspend them now. There's some misperception among the public about the kind of exercises that are conducted. Obviously, at the battalion level, the company level, our troops and South Korean troops are training every single day. Some of the biggest exercises are done at the division or the corps level. Oftentimes they're what you might call a tabletop exercise in a room like this with lots of screens everywhere. They don't involve, tens of thousands of troops. They can, but I would go forward with all of those exercises. We have one big one in the spring, one big one in the fall. We didn't conduct the biggest one in the fall. The spring is coming, so I would do that. And as I said, we ought not to allow North Korea to drag these discussions out indefinitely. So I do think it's a 2019 matter, not a 2020 matter.
So conducting them obviously sends an important political message, right, to Kim Jong-un. Is there a military dimension that if we suspend these for a certain period of time, we start to erode our military capabilities?
So it's always better to train than not train when they're in the military, but that's why I just make the point that our troops are always training up to a fairly high level of maneuver. They may not be training at the very highest level where you have general officers and colonels from both of our countries working at the command and control level. That's not good. They need that, just like a private needs training on shoot, move, and communicate skills. But to me, there's no reason right now to leave them suspended.
In the back.
Thank you. Ishan Tharoor of the Washington Post. Senator Cotton, you suggested that some of Saudi Arabia's more recent, as you put it, bold behavior can be explained by the insecurities they feel both at home politically as well as by the actions of Iran and the region around them. Do we justify the death of Jamal Khashoggi because of those insecurities? And I'd like you to react to the vote that happened yesterday in the Senate as well. What are your thoughts? A lot of your colleagues may not see the situation the same way you do.
No, I don't think we justify that terrible murder at all, and we've taken steps to hold accountable those people who were responsible for it by imposing sanctions and other punishments on them. Secretary Mattis and Secretary Pompeo testified to the Senate a couple weeks ago about the best state of our intelligence. They both said afterwards in public, sense of what they said in private, which is they have seen no direct evidence of the involvement of the Crown Prince in that murder in advance. I don't know that that's changed any, and I support what Secretary Mattis and Secretary Pompeo said. If new evidence emerges that others were involved in as well, I think we should take similar steps to hold them accountable. What I don't think we should do is sunder an important partnership that we've had for 75 years across many different kinds of presidents and many different kinds of threats at a time when Iran is the gravest threat that we face in the Middle East. On yesterday's vote in Yemen, about the Yemen War Powers Resolution, so first off, the War Powers Resolution, in my opinion, is unconstitutional. So the action we took yesterday was not a constitutional law. It's not going to pass into law. The House has a rule in effect that says they won't consider it during this Congress anyway. To me, it's short-sighted to tell the Saudis and the Emiratis that we are no longer going to provide them the kind of information and intelligence to help reduce civilian casualties and help them comply with the law of armed conflict. If we were to say that, if we were to withdraw all of our analysts or all of our assistants, you wouldn't magically have peace in Yemen because the various factions in Yemen are going to continue fighting each other. The Iranians are going to continue to support their proxies, and the Saudis and Emiratis, therefore, are going to have to continue their fight as well, as almost any nation would if they had missiles flying into their capital. So I think it's in our best interest. It's also in the interest of ultimately a peaceful resolution of that conflict and addressing the humanitarian challenges there by helping them minimize civilian casualties, helping them adhere to the law of armed conflict. We have our own threats in Yemen as well. You know, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS is there. Some of the most capable terrorist planners in terms of external operations in the world live there. The Houthis have used missiles and armed unmanned aerial vehicles to threaten areas where we have hundreds of thousands of troops and citizens and international shipping through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. So while I would like to see a quick and rapid resolution of the conflict in Yemen, I don't think we're going to get that simply by the U.S. withdrawing any kind of support whatsoever for the coalition.
Yes, sir.
It's a very creative way to get your attention. Turn on your iPhone camera.
I think we got to, sir, just one sec. Thank you.
Henry Shore, I'm the ambassador of the Netherlands. On the INF Treaty, the direct cause, I think, for the United States stepping back from the INF Treaty was the development of mid-range ballistic missiles by the Russians. Now, assuming that they won't come to their senses in the coming 6 months, you would be free from the INF Treaty. Would you start developing the same kind of range missiles, which would stand to reason? And then, of course, for us as Europeans, the main question would be, where would you place them? Because if they have to threaten Russia, you cannot put them here because they don't threaten Russia. Would you consider putting them in Europe?
Netherlands?
Like, yes.
We would build the kind of intermediate range missiles that we need to protect our interests and protect our allies. Right now, the United States is the only country in the world that refrains from building these missiles because Russia and the United States are the only 2 countries in the INF, and Russia's violating it. So it's not just a matter of what's happening in Europe with Russia's violations, also China and the missiles that they are building that are all land launched that go easily range Taiwan and Japan that can range many of our ships as well. I don't think we can allow that strategic relationship to continue. So I wouldn't necessarily match the exact kind of weapons that Russia has because they face a different geopolitical situation. I would build the weapons that we need to defend our interests. And you can see that our interests are imperiled in Europe. General Mark Milley, Chief of Staff of the Army, who will be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has testified repeatedly, as has General Scaparrotti, the commander of European Command, that in Europe we are outranged and outgunned by Russian missile forces because they are not adhering to the INF, which means, put simply, Russia can reach out and touch our soldiers with missiles and we can't strike back against them. So I would rapidly develop the kind of missiles that we need to maintain the stable balance in Europe and also offset China's missile buildup. Basing questions obviously can be controversial, but that would be a decision to be made for the future.
Senator, what was your reaction to the National Defense Strategy Commission report? And I guess I should tell everybody
that you were on it?
That I served on the panel. I mean, it was pretty stark.
It was good. I mean, I think our national defense strategy was good, but the National Defense Strategy Commission, which is a bipartisan commission of luminaries that Congress has asked every 4 years to review the national defense strategy, free of the kind of bureaucratic or political constraints that the Department of Defense inherently operates within. And while you had many favorable things to say about the national defense strategy, you also pointed out things that, like, that kind of stable, predictable, and gradually increasing funding is imperiling our military readiness, and that we face a very complex threat or set of threats because of the kind of threats we've discussed: a rising China, you know, a revanchist, aggressive Russia, rogue actors like North Korea and Iran. A lot of it gets down into the kind of programmatic issues that we deal with on the Armed Services Committee, you know, recruiting and retaining the right number of troops and the right mix of troops for the battles we need to fight today and the ones we need to win tomorrow. Same kind of weapons platform. We talk about that a lot. If you haven't read it, I would all read it. The National Defense Strategy to me every 4 years is at least as essential, if not more essential reading than the National Defense Strategy itself.
Yes, ma'am.
George Shapitsky, Atlantic Council Board member. Senator, in Venezuela has been taken over by the FARC, by mafia, by kleptocrats, and similar processes are going on in Nicaragua. Some people are even predicting that this is going to happen, that this virus might even spread to Mexico, to our borders. Obviously, it creates a very dangerous situation for the United States. Also, that danger is exacerbated by the fact that it creates very fertile ground for Putin to cut deals with these rulers, these thugs. In Venezuela, he's already doing that. He's in effect getting control over the world's largest oil deposits, all of Venezuela's gold deposits. He's getting control over the harbors. So it's creating a very dangerous situation for the United States. And I think we're going to be very interested in solving that problem. At the same time, Putin is obviously very active in Ukraine and in different ways, creating problems from Ukraine, trying to suborn it, and creating issues for the United States and the West. How would you react, and how would you recommend we react if at some point Putin says, look, let's make a deal. We'll honor the Morell Doctrine and stay out of the Western Hemisphere. You can have Venezuela back, but you guys stay out of Ukraine and stay out of our backyard.
I'm not sure, given its current state, we would want Venezuela back right now. I would not accept that kind of agreement. One, I don't think you can trust Vladimir Putin on those kind of agreements. It's much easier for him to meddle and interfere in places like Ukraine, given the lines of communication there, than it is for us to help Nicaragua and Venezuela stabilize and become, you know, more peaceful and prosperous, as we've helped Colombia do over the last 20 years. But I wouldn't trust Vladimir Putin to uphold that bargain either. Venezuela is a very hard case, but you know, so was Colombia 20 or 25 years ago. And not everything is perfect in Colombia, but it's a lot better than it was because of a very concerted effort by the United States government as a whole, but especially our intelligence community and the State Departments and the military. We can't do that with the Maduro government, obviously, but just because Venezuela is a basket case right now and it's a breeding ground for instability in Latin America doesn't mean that it's always going to remain that way. It wasn't that way 25 years ago. And again, if we were to allow Vladimir Putin to inch by inch encroach on first Crimea, eastern Ukraine, the Sea of Azov, maybe meddle somewhat in the Balkans as well, continue to do what he's been doing in the Western Balkans for the last several years, all we're doing is encouraging him to take ever bolder steps up to the doorstep of NATO. And his long-term geopolitical goal of his would be to fracture NATO unity and the Article 5 commitment that we have among each other. Doesn't have to have a general war to do that, just has to undermine the credibility of that. I think that would be unwise steps to take. I mean, he acts the way weaker powers always do. They never go for the jugular at a stroke against their more powerful adversary. They always take incremental steps that are just below the threshold of retaliation. You know, we talk a lot today about gray zones. Gray zones have existed for as long as mankind has lived in political communities and had to defend those, because people like Vladimir Putin and nations like Russia don't want to go for the jugular against an alliance like NATO or an adversary like Russia, like the United States. We just have to remember that at some point, those incremental steps give him a position of strategic advantage against which we would fight only at great cost.
One more question. Time for one more question. Yes, ma'am, right here.
Thank you. I'm Ellen Nakashima with the Washington Post. Thank you both for your remarks. And Senator, I also enjoyed your interview with Mike on his podcast a few months ago. A little shout out to you, Mike, for your podcast. I wanted to ask a couple of questions about China. You're aware of the arrest of the chief financial officer of Huawei earlier this month. And then a couple of days ago, President Trump suggested in an interview with Reuters that he would be willing to intervene in the U.S. extradition request to Canada for the CFO if it would advance his trade agenda with China. What do you think of the wisdom of that statement? And what kind of message do you, you're a lawyer, what kind of message do you think it sends to law enforcement? And then more broadly, given the long-term strategic threat that China poses to the U.S. in the economy, advanced technology, militarily, do you think the United States government has a coherent, unified, whole-of-government strategy to really counter and push back against China to ensure that it doesn't eventually supplant the U.S. through unfair means in terms of advanced technologies, through its forced technology transfers, et cetera? What would you do? Would you, want to see stronger sanctions, et cetera? Yeah. Those are my questions.
So on the first question, I commend the President of the Department of Justice for arresting Huawei's CFO. She's not just the CFO, she's the daughter of an icon of the company. By all accounts, it appears that she was facilitating sanctions violations against Iran. I want to see her extradited, and I want to see her face the full force of U.S. law for violating those sanctions, if in fact we prove that. Now, we have to recognize that when you're dealing with someone like that, it does have strategic implications. And Mike could give you a legion of story of spy swaps during the Cold War, or even after the Cold War, back in 2010. I would not, though, offer to send her back to China or decline to press charges in return for trade agreements. I don't think that would be a wise course of action. It would send the wrong signal to Xi Jinping. It would send the wrong signal to our allies. And we can get good trade agreements without doing that. We don't have to do so. The second part of your question, so it's the safest answer to any time someone asks if the U.S. government has a whole-of-government approach to any problem is usually to say, not really. I would say, though, that we have a more coherent China policy now than we did 2 years ago. I'd say probably than we have in modern times. I mean, I think in retrospect, one of the main mistakes that both parties made was giving China most favored nation status in the late 1990s and accepting them into the World Trade Organization. There was an argument made at the time that, well, they're going to become more market-based, and therefore they'll have more economic freedom, and they'll want more political freedom, and they're liberalized, and they'll become just like the Netherlands. That obviously has not been the case. I don't think the evidence was there at the time for the case. I think some people making that case were making it as a pretext because they wanted to get in the Chinese market, or they wanted to source Chinese products, or they wanted to move factories to China. That's been kind of the context, though, of our relationship through most of the 2000s. over the last couple of years, in part because of administration policy, in part because of Chinese actions, like militarizing the South China Sea, or not doing its part to address the North Korea problem, its repression of its Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. I think you're seeing more of a kind of comprehensive, well-considered policy. Trade and economics being an important part of that, but far from the only part of that China policy.
Please join me in thanking Senator Cotton for joining us.